Today we're joined by Shaun Rein. Again, he's an entrepreneur and he's a successful author of many books on China, and which we'll link right below this video. Now today we called Shaun because he has been in Xinjiang, and for the few who don't know, it's this autonomous region in the northwest of China, which is, let's say, a bit of a controversial issue, especially in the media. Just to give you an idea, I'm going to read you what the Wikipedia page, so this is not even like a Western media or anything, this is just the Wikipedia page, what it says about what's going on in the autonomous region of Xinjiang. It says, the Chinese government has committed a series of ongoing human rights abuses against the Uyghurs, and that is often characterized as genocide, has pursued policies that incarcerated more than an estimated 1 million Muslim in internment camps without legal process. And this is the largest scale detention of ethnic and religious minorities since World War II. Experts estimate that since 2017 has been 16,000 mosques that have been razed and damaged. 16,000, that's not a mistake. And hundreds of children forcibly separated from their parents. So this is the narrative that you also find on the Western media often. And you have been there. You've been there recently. You've been there many times. You met people. You met all kinds of people. Let's just remind the audience that Uyghur is the Xinjiang region is composed by maybe 44% of Uyghurs, but it's also composed by like almost half of Han Chinese. So it's not a complete majority of Uyghur Muslim. And so just tell us about your experience. What have you seen?
Well, it's nice to see you, Christian. The last time we spoke, I was locked down in my home in Shanghai during quarantine. Ultimately, I was locked in the home for 11 weeks and we were unable to go out. I'm now back in my office here in Lujiazui in Shanghai. Things are getting better in China, but 40% of my employees were actually locked down a second time after the first liberation from quarantine. And I think many people here might have seen the images of shoppers running out of IKEA or workers in Tencent in Shenzhen trying to run out of their headquarters. So basically the economy is starting to rebound, but it's still in a very delicate position because people are quite concerned about getting locked down again, which is really crunching and stopping people from being able to do face-to-face meetings, people being able to travel. So for instance, trying to get back to your topic of Xinjiang, I was just in Xinjiang in July and part of August, and I actually left early. I was in Kashgar at the time traveling. I was there for 2 weeks, and I was going to continue my trip to Akasu or to Hetian and travel around, but we started seeing the COVID cases going up in Ili and around in Ulamuchi, so we got nervous, and I was right. We left early, and I think it was the day after we left, they actually put a lockdown in on Ulamuchi, and they've had several hundred cases. So I just wanted to start off by talking about the COVID situation. Now, when it comes to Xinjiang, I think you see a lot of narrative in the Western press, and a lot of it clearly is very exaggerated. It's clearly very sensationalized. And then you also read the Chinese government view, which I think hews more to the truth, certainly than the Western side, but it also skips some of the very real problems that have emerged in Xinjiang. So for example, this last summer, I spent several weeks in Xinjiang interviewing a lot of the Uyghurs, and they told me, that there is still a lot of ethnic tension between Uyghurs and Han Chinese. Now, you don't read that in the Chinese press. They often say there's just a lot of peace and harmony, between the different ethnic groups. But I think it's quite clear from my interviews that there definitely is a lot of ethnic tension. Now, I think what's important to note, Christian, is that none of the Uyghurs that I interviewed said that this is the fault of the Chinese government. Okay, they've all said that the Chinese government is trying to help the situation and make it better. But there definitely is a lot of tension. Now, part of the problem, for instance, is pork. Okay, the Uyghurs tend to be Muslim and they don't like to eat pork, and they don't like that the Han Chinese are always eating pork. Then the Han Chinese don't understand why the Uyghurs aren't eating pork, which I think is the largest protein or meat protein that mainland Chinese eat. So I think it's natural for there to be tension because there are different cultures. But at the end of the day, when I spoke to Uyghurs and I spoke to Han Chinese, and I also interviewed a lot of Uzbeks and Kazakhs and other ethnic minorities living in the Xinjiang, they all said at the end of the day, they're all Chinese. And I think that's very important. You know, a lot of Uyghurs would come to me and say, welcome to China, which I thought was kind of cute and very nice of them.
And I would say that, I imagine, in Chinese, or would I refer to you in Chinese? Would I speak to you in Chinese?
Yeah, they spoke to me in Chinese. I don't speak the Uyghur language, but I think it's clear that the Uyghur language is still being protected. You see a lot of signs on the street. It's still in the Uyghur language, especially in all of the state-owned for facades like Bank of China or China Mobile. They definitely had the Uyghur language. When I was in Kashgar, I interviewed a young woman who's Uyghur, and she's a teacher. And she laughed and she goes, oh, our students, they have to learn English, they have to learn Uyghur, and they have to learn Mandarin. So I think for them, it's clear that the main language of instruction is Mandarin, which, you know, some people could criticize because it's not the cultural language Uyghur that Uyghurs originally spoke for hundreds of years. But you got to remember they're part of China. And so you have to have a unified language in order to better these kids so that they can get good job opportunities later on. So I don't view teaching them Mandarin as the main language of instruction as cultural genocide or anything nefarious. It's saying we're one country. We all have to learn the same language. It's the same thing that's happening in Shanghai. You know, in Shanghai, most people speak Shanghainese as their first native language, but in the official schools, they have to learn Mandarin. Now, again, the Uyghur language is still being taught in the schools, according to the school teachers that I interviewed. So, you know, it's open for debate. It's open for discussion. If people want to criticize that they're learning Mandarin, fine, but don't call that genocide. It's not. It's the same thing in the United States. The Hispanics who are in the United States have to learn English in schools.
Well, I would just have to say that even in Europe, I mean, one of the languages that people want to learn most, it's definitely Chinese. I mean, English, it's already something that people take it for granted that you would speak. But Chinese, if you know Chinese, then you do have a sort of a portal open to the Asia, to the Asian like work market, and so it would be weird that people living within the China Republic do not want to learn or even dream about learning something that again, it's not only in the media, it's the government, it's everywhere, so it affects their own lives. So I mean, this of course, the question about the language, I find it quite futile, honestly. But the one thing that I wanted to ask you, since before the COVID, I contacted a friend of mine who's in China because I wanted to go and see in Xinjiang myself because of one specific situation, which is the one concerning the encampment, the so-called concentration camp, of what the media calls, of some Uyghurs. Now, is this happening? What level is happening? Now, maybe not many people know that one of the things the government is trying to do, and it's been a lot of terrorist attacks by Muslims in Xinjiang, especially against policemen, against regular people. And so one of the claims is that from the government is that it's trying to put down on these fanatics. Now, where does this balance goes when it comes down to encampment, this concentrations of concentration camp, let's call it what the media calls it, and how much are these fanatics? How much are these people they're trying to put them arrest and moderate, so to speak, and how much are them just regular people, as the media claims?
So I don't have proof of anything either way. Okay. So, you know, I traveled, you know, I've been to Xinjiang 3 times in the last year for over a month. I traveled through, you know, 6 major cities, regions, interviewed a lot of people. You know, when I went, the first 2 trips I went with Xinhua News. This last trip I went on my own. When I was with Xinhua, we did interview people who said that they were put into these educational institutions and were taught Mandarin and were taught skills in order to get better jobs. Now, they might have been like a Potemkin village for all I know. You know, they were chosen by Xinhua, so I don't know how truthful all that is. When I went on my own and I interviewed a lot of people, nobody talked about concentration camps. Nobody seemed scared of the government. there didn't seem to be major issues. People had talked that 10, 15 years ago, a lot of bad things happened and it was quite dangerous to walk around Xinjiang. And so they're very thankful to the government now that in their mind, Xinjiang might be the safest place in the world. This is what a lot of people, Uyghurs and Han Chinese alike, told me that, before, danger. Now it's one of the safest places to be. I can't speak specifically to concentration camps, whether they're there or not, because they could be there and I didn't see anything. But from my experience, people tended to support the government and I didn't hear any fear. Now, what I could see is that there's heavy-handedness. And that's something that I think the Chinese government sometimes says. Even here in Shanghai, people could criticize the heavy-handedness of all of the COVID crackdown, right? Again, I spent 11 weeks of my life stuck in my house because of COVID. Some people could say that's heavy-handed. Now, in many ways, I think they've gone to the extreme on the lockdown. If they caged people in their homes, they put up fences. Personally, I don't particularly like that, but I don't consider any of the COVID crackdown to be evil. I don't consider that to come from a bad place where they're trying to harm the people of Shanghai. I think the government was trying to help the people of Shanghai, and maybe they went too far. That potentially could be the case in Xinjiang as well. I haven't heard of, killings. There might be, but I haven't heard of it from people in Xinjiang, but there might have been some policies that people don't like. So for instance, I tried to visit a village with a young woman who's Uyghur, and she said that when somebody visits her home, you have to report to the neighborhood committee or government that somebody's visiting the home, even if it's their relatives. Now, to me, that sounds kind of crazy, right? Anytime somebody visits your home, you have to report to the government that you have a visitor. That might be heavy-handed. And that's something that, you could criticize because it's truthful. Now, I could also see the government wanting to do this in case there is a lot of extremism, in case there is a lot of terrorism. They can track, potential cells. It's the same type of thing. Everywhere you go in Shanghai now, or pretty much anywhere in China, you have to swipe your health code to show that you've been in a store. They want to be able to track you in case you're a close contact of a close contact with COVID. So, there are things that you could criticize in Xinjiang when it comes to heavy-handedness potentially. But again, as far as I've seen, I haven't seen anything that I would be, from a human rights standpoint, I'm 100% against as being evil. And for me, I had family who died and suffered during the Holocaust in Nazi Germany and in Hungary and in Poland, because I'm Jewish on my father's side. I'm very sensitive to terms like genocide. I'm very sensitive to racism. So is it good that people are watching Xinjiang to ensure that there is nothing bad happening? Absolutely. That should be way everywhere in the world. But I think you have to make sure that you don't sensationalize, and I think certainly the New York Times and other places are doing that. The New York Times, Li Yuan, a columnist there, has said that they're trying to Xinjiang V Shanghai. And again, I live in Shanghai. I'm not going to say that China's government is evil in Shanghai. So if that's what Li Yuan and the New York Times is saying is evil, then where's the proof of real evil in Xinjiang? Because I don't see that happening.
Well, this a bit reminds me when I went to Cuba. So in Cuba, the one thing that struck me, like probably had the same impression on you, was in Xinjiang, was that if a Cuban would go from a province to another, he had to inform the police, basically, of the movement, just of going to let's say from one city to another, that it's in a different province. And that to me always struck me as totally nuts. I mean, there's something like a government like the Cuba dictatorship would do, which made no sense. And they actually had people on the streets checking people and their documentations and all that, especially people that work with foreigners that were particularly targeted. Now, how is the presence of police in Uyghur in the villages or in the cities compared to what their presence is in China? Are there more policemen, or is there more of a sort of a feel of a state police there than there is in other parts of China?
No, I didn't find there to be a heavy police presence anywhere. It was very similar to the rest of China. It's pretty rare to see police actually with armed guns. This is a big difference in China and the United States. Until recently, actually, no Chinese police were allowed to carry guns. Now they've allowed it for a very limited number of SWAT-like police. But you don't see many police in Xinjiang. on that. You know, you see a lot of police, what they've now set up in recent years are checkpoints going into new villages or towns, and that's more for COVID. So it's annoying as heck. Basically, when you go into a new town, you have to show your ID, register why you're going there. But what everyone has told me, that's not because of, you know, control over Uyghurs, it's just control over COVID. They're petrified of COVID spreading. And, you know, I used to make fun of it and said, why am I getting tested every day? But right now there's a massive explosion of COVID in Xinjiang. They're now one of the worst hit provinces in the country. So you don't see that many police. You do see a lot of cameras. Cameras are something that are all over China, not just in Xinjiang, it's all over in Shanghai. And I think you can see the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal have written this as something nefarious. I think 2 Wall Street Journal reporters are just released a book called The Surveillance State that's criticizing all of the cameras. I actually like the cameras. I think it creates a lot of safety. I'll give an example. I was driving the other day in Shanghai. The car in front of me, a Buick, was smashed by a Porsche. And the Porsche rammed right into it and then drove off. And when I jumped out to help the Buick driver, a police came by about 5 minutes later, and I said, I can't believe this guy drove over. And the police woman looked at me and said, don't worry, pointed up at the cameras and said, we have it all on camera. We'll be able to catch him. So, you know, I think the cameras are actually good because it stops crime. You know, it gives truth. It actually stops corruption. One of the things people don't realize is that 15, 20 years ago, the corruption amongst the rank and file police was terrible. For instance, if you were driving a car and the police stopped you for driving too fast, you could bribe them. Now you can't. Now, because of the cameras, the police can't be bribed. So I actually, for the most part, I'm 95% in favor of all the cameras everywhere throughout China, not just in Xinjiang. It's not nefarious like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal make it out to be.
Well, yeah, and I consider also here in Japan, they basically caught the reason was a nefarious accident. There was a killing, a very terrible killing, and they only caught the perpetrator, which he took a train, took a taxi, then took a flight, and then they caught him like within a day, within 24 hours, thanks to cameras. They were actually able to catch the license plate with the taxi he got onto, and they didn't know anything about this guy. And they were only able to do this by cameras. So people here feel pretty safe as well, like with the presence of cameras, honestly. And we know the cities like London as well, that's in the center of London, there's cameras every like, what, 5 meters? There's not like 1 square meters that it's not under surveillance. So
I think the key of this, Christian, is you're basically saying there's a double standard, right?
Yeah,
so if it's cameras in London or in Japan, the Anglo-Saxon press will say this is for safety. When it comes into China, it's nefarious, right? When, you know, in the United States, you have affirmative action and you're trying to help the minorities in the United States who are poor or impoverished get access to English and good schools, that's affirmative action, that's scholarships, that's good things. In China, that's cultural genocide or even genocide. I mean, I interviewed many Uyghur kids, many teenagers who were sent outside of the province to study in high school in the Dongbei region of China, and they loved it. You know, they were paid their full tuition, their room and board, and they were able to go to another province surrounded by Han Chinese and learn. I think that's an amazing thing, right? That to me is something that the Chinese government should be applauded for doing, because they're enabling and empowering these people to learn. In the United States, you're taking kids out of the projects in New York, you know, Brooklyn, Bronx, or in Baltimore, and then you're sending them to the top prep schools, boarding schools, or sending them to the Ivy League like Harvard. That's called affirmative action. That's called cultural genocide in the Anglo-Saxon press towards China. It's really ridiculous.
While you're at it, let's not forget, and this is something that you rarely see on the news, that in the exams for the major league universities in America, the Asians, especially the Chinese, as they are the majority, are actually penalized because they have a stronger, a higher percentage points they have to pass compared to other ethnic groups. And this is really talked about because apparently they don't want a majority of Chinese. There was a professor that said if the Asians, the Chinese had the same standard as the other ethnic groups, that would be what, 90% Chinese in all the biggest universities in America. So they're trying to clamp that down. But this again, this rarely gets on the news.
And I think it's key that you have to look with your own eyes, right? At the end of the day, you don't want to take face value what the Anglo-Saxon press is saying about Xinjiang. You also don't want to take, face value what the Chinese government's propaganda is on Xinjiang, right? The truth is somewhere in the middle. And I think for me, what was also interesting was I went with Xinhua News twice again, and I went on my own. And basically the responses from people that I interviewed were about 95% the same. The only difference is that when I traveled alone, both ethnic groups were willing to say that ethnic tension is worse than what many people realize. And so that's something we need to work at. I think the Chinese government is working on that. They've tried to promote Han Chinese and Uyghurs marrying. To me, intermarriage is a great thing. I'm half Chinese, I'm half Jewish. This is something, mixed babies is good. You've seen some people, in the United States, press, some reporters from Radio Free Asia have accused this as being genocide or cultural genocide again, because they're forcing Uyghur women to marry Han Chinese men. And that's ridiculous. I actually was interviewing a 22-year-old Uyghur woman, and she told me that she wants to marry a Uyghur man. She prefers Uyghur men, but she said a lot of her friends are marrying Han Chinese men. And I said, is that, being welcomed? She's like, of course it's being welcomed. We're one country, one people. So I think, people need to take with a grain of salt, what's being written about Xinjiang, and importantly, try to get here on your own. There are actually no restriction for foreigners to visit Xinjiang. You don't need a special visa or a special travel permit. You do need a special travel permit to go into certain areas, but usually you can get that. You just have to report that you're visiting, and then they just make sure you're not CIA or doing something bad, and they'll let you in. Xinjiang is actually fairly open for Western tourists to travel around, unlike Tibet. Actually, in Tibet, you need a special permit, which is something that I've actually criticized government officials in backroom meetings, saying that they should get rid of that because it makes it seem like the government's trying to hide something. And the reality is Tibet is absolutely flourishing. I went there twice last year.
And maybe the forced marriages that you were talking about maybe are just arranged marriages, like it happens every day here in Japan. We wouldn't know anyway. Some people call it forced marriage if two families get together and decide to have their children married, because there's also an interpretation on that. But we'll close on that. But it's interesting that you when you said about the tension, you mentioned the meat, the food factor, which is something people don't really think about. Like I wouldn't have thought that would be such of a real issue. As you know, many Muslims are moderate even in accepting. Let's look at India. If you go to India, there's a restaurant next to the other, and there's Muslim, there's vegetarians, and there's no problem at all. But you're saying that it's quite of an issue there.
Pork was probably one of the 2-3 things that was brought up the most when I asked both Han Chinese and Uyghurs what was the underlying cause of the tension. And pork is something that they brought up time after time, which is something that I had never heard of before. I didn't realize it was such a big deal. But I think, to sort of sum it up, Christian, is there's definitely some problems in Xinjiang. There might be some heavy-handedness, but it's clear that the government is playing a positive role in the development of Xinjiang for Han Chinese, and most definitely for Uyghurs. They get special benefits when applying to college. They get low interest loans if they're an entrepreneur. And that the whole trajectory of Xinjiang is on a very positive development. That doesn't mean some bad things don't happen here or there. I'm sure there are. But net, the trend is quite positive. And I feel comfortable saying that. And I'll go back to Xinjiang and I'll keep kicking the tires and looking around. I visited cotton fields, I visited factories, I've interviewed people, and nothing that I've seen so far puts up massive red flags. There still might be out there. Other people should take a look around, but the key is to use real data and not just make up things and be sensationalized for the sake of getting famous or for the sake of trying to demonize and attack China.
Great, that's a really fresh take that we got from you, and you got the COVID period, so that'd be interesting to see also in your future trips there how the situation changes. So it's been great hearing you, like always. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.